I'm joined by Sean Heron, and we're going to be talking about his game Final Spike today. So thank you, Sean, for taking a little bit of time to sit with us, talk with us, and give us a little background on this game.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So to get started, for people that might not have heard of Final Spike, uh, give us a pitch. What is the game? Why should people be excited?
Right. So, Final Spike is a one-on-one local multiplayer beach volleyball game. As for why you're excited about it, basically, I like to think of it as Windjammers, but for beach volleyball. Very high action, very high intensity, very easy to grasp in terms of the overall um, rules of the game.
Sure.
Mechanically, not mechanically it starts off very simple, but then the more you play it, the more underlying systems you find. You can basically get by just by like setting the ball, spiking the ball, and sliding into it. But then as you interact with those systems more and more, you begin to get a clear understanding of like just how complex the game actually gets.
Cool. So we ran into each other at Play NYC this year. And you told me the story of kind of how Final Spike got rolling and how the inspiration for the game uh, came to be. But I'd love for you to reiterate that because I think it's a pretty funny story.
Right. So the whole story, basically, when I first came up with the first prototype for Final Spike, I was finishing up my MFA at NYU in
Mm-hmm.
game design. So I was taking a prototyping class with Bennett Foddy, and so this was probably the last week of class. I think he said, "So for our last week of prototype studio, you have a week to come up with a game that could be licensed, by the Olympic Committee as like an Olympics game." And I'm like, "Okay." I don't like sports. Um, Ironically enough, so like that was not a that was an interesting time at school, but I eventually thought on it along the lines of if there is a sport that is kind of the most interesting to me, like the least offensive to my non-sports senses to turn into a video game, what is it? I'm like, well, beach volleyball works, right?
There you
And
go.
so yeah, that's literally how I wound up doing that initially. It was a really big hit at the end of your showcase. Like I was showcasing my thesis game,
Mm-hmm.
and then my mom came. He was like, "Sean, you realize people have been playing your game like all night, right? Like I've been taking video, and people have been playing and playing and playing." So it turned out to be very popular, like both there and during the actual week of testing during Prototype Studio. So I decided, all right, might as well push this as far as I can, make it last for a while, and then see what happens. That's
Yeah,
pretty much the story.
awesome. I think it's really funny. Kind of sometimes putting yourself in a place that you wouldn't normally put yourself is can come up with really good stuff. So that's a good little lesson. I was hoping you might talk a little bit about the complexity that you've put into Final Spike and kind of why necessarily. Because initially when I was looking at Final Spike, you're right. It does seem like you can kind of get by being pretty straightforward. Just spiking the ball, kind of doing the basics.
Hmm.
But I really love that you've layered some complexity to the mechanics and not really made it immediately obvious. You kind of got to dig a little bit. So
Yeah.
maybe talk about how you went about designing those mechanics that way.
Right. So a lot of it really is kind of the product of a lot of playtesting, just like over the year or so that I've been developing it. But mostly, um, I would say one of the core things that I wound up chasing after aesthetically, which wound up tying into the mechanics really enough, is that, like I said, Windjammers but beach volleyball. And so
Mm-hmm.
Windjammers itself also has that very kind of straightforward kind of look to it. But then there are also things like, okay, well, if you stop the flying disc like this, it can go up and you can do a power shot and all this other
Sure.
stuff. So Final Spike kind of had a lot of very similar evolutions in that vein. Like, okay, initially I was like, okay, sure, you can slide into the ball and knocks it up and then you can spike it down. Like, all right, what are ways that now this can kind of become more exciting? Well, okay, what if there's a way to like actually stun the other player so that you can get an easier score? And at first it was like, okay, maybe you can just bash them with your fist straight up and that's fine. But that eventually got to the point where it's like, okay, that just means people play at the net. They kind of bonk each other over the head, and nothing really
Combat
happens, right?
volleyball.
Right? It was kind of getting away from the point. And so what happened from there? It's like, okay, well, if the ball is already the medium by which we're doing a lot of this stuff, maybe there's just a way to charge the ball so that this happens instead. And that's where I initially got the conceit of, okay, you slide into the ball, it's charged up, you jump for it, spike, and then that's kind of how that goes. And then once I came up with that, a lot of the other stuff kind of just gradually came from continuing to develop it out, getting a lot of feedback around like, oh, hey, well, you have spiking, but it's really hard to react to. That's when the slowdown that happens with spikes came in. Then after that, it was like, okay, well, you have this thing with final spiking and everything, but like it's still a very hard tactic to beat. If the only thing you can do is slide into it, I'm like, okay, so then you can use a set now to knock the ball up and away, and it's fine. But then it also became a question of, all right, well, you have this interaction, but now how do you deal with like regular spikes? Sure, they don't stun you or anything, but they're still very aggressive. How do you deal with that? I'm like, well, took a little advice, did a little bit of reflecting, like, oh, literally, I can just have it set up so that if you set the ball when it's been spiked at you, it reflects it. Like a lot of that little stuff kind of just evolved from a lot of playtesting.
Cool.
For the most part, and then sort of just trusting my gut or getting some tips from like other games to look at, and then that's sort of how a lot of the complexity sort of came in.
Perfect. Last thing I'd like to ask about the game is kind of what challenges you've had in getting it to this point where it is out now on itch. There's an itch page. You got a trailer out. What were some of the challenges you ran into? Not necessarily just from game development, though I'd be interested to know if there were any specific technical challenges you ran into, but also in showing the game off.
Yeah, well, I can do technical challenges first. So, Final Spike is, while it's not the first game I've ever made, it is the first game I've ever considered like releasing commercially. And so there were a lot of things that I wanted to do that I kind of didn't really budget for properly or other things. And so I kind of had to make do in a couple of ways. I know the biggest technical challenge that I had, which was something that unfortunately had to be scrapped, was like net play. I wanted to have local was like always the thing on the table, and I always wanted that, but I also wanted to be able to say, oh yeah, you can totally go and play online and all that other stuff. I didn't really. What really happened was that I made the decision to like build out a lot more features and then try to go back to add net play, which it caused trouble in terms of like trying to set up the data that would be saved on the server and what would be passed from client to client and a lot of other things that I hadn't really considered before because I hadn't really thought about net play in that broad of a sense. And so basically in order to get it in, I'd have had to like refactor a whole bunch of stuff. It was a very hard choice, but I was like, you know what, it's gotta cut that. Yeah. Another major challenge, I guess, believe it or not, was actually kind of a lot of the art style stuff. Final Spike as it is, by the time I was really thinking about maybe I should get another artist to get on this, the thing about it is that I'd already kind of been developing it for a while, and I was at a space where me doing the art myself let me have better control over my workflow to a certain extent.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't so much I'm like, oh, I have nobody I want to collaborate with, but more like, well, by the time I can get them on board and like get them to be like, all right, this is kind of the style I want and all this other stuff, it would have been, I felt like I would have lost a lot of ground on that. And so the technical challenge then became, okay, I can draw, but only so far, which means that a lot of the way that the game looks and feels is going to have to be within the confines of what it is that I know how to do as an artist. And so part of it was me sort of very deliberately leaning into like a very straightforward artistic aesthetic. Like things are, if you look at the game, like it's basically all vector art. There is very minimal shading and little things like that. A lot of it is very flat, but then I sort of had to compensate by going for like a lot of exaggerated emotion where I could pull that out and a lot of other stuff. Especially even like the character profiles is basically just a result of me starting with boxes that had like really crude looking hands sticking out of them and then like sticking with that, but refining it closer to like a human-sized sprite. But it still creates a very distinct profile when you look at the characters move and everything. Yeah. And in a sense, that has actually helped with some of the showcasing stuff. Because people will joke about it, but then they'll be like, oh yeah, wait a minute, I didn't realize that was just an arm. And so they're kind of just running around with their arms up all the time. I'm like, yeah. But that has been a very distinct visual feature that has endeared people to the game a lot, I think. And especially since I kind of decided to compensate for a lot of that with making the game very colorful and also as much juice as I could fit into it as I could without getting too obnoxious. Like those two things I think have been the major visual selling points for the game in particular.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I think that's perfect. That's a cool. That's a nice point to bring up in the issue of yeah, if you don't have somebody helping with art, you've got to do it all, but you do get to have your fidelity with it. You get to control it. Um, the balancing game, I guess. So moving from talking about Final Spike specifically, you already talked about kind of where you got to in a place of being a student and developing Final Spike. But maybe you could talk about a little bit about what drew you to want to go into game design.
In the first place, right?
Yeah.
Well, whew. So if you believe the story that my mom tells about this kind of thing, I apparently know that I wanted to be a game designer since sometime in middle school. I think I can corroborate. I can corroborate that. It's probably true. Um, for me, I think a lot of what inspired me was just the fact that I grew up playing video games. Like Pokemon Red was, I'm reasonably sure, like my first actual game ever. So there was that. A lot more RPGs coming up, a lot more action games coming up. So like Breath of Fire, Mega Man, Metroid, all of those games. When I was playing them, I always had this distinct feeling like it's very hard to kind of articulate it. I just had a feeling that I was really experiencing stories the way that I didn't realize I wanted to until I played those games. And then, especially with things like Metroid Fusion, where it's like, okay, now we've moved to the stage where a lot of the same anxieties that I'm having while playing this are reasonably the anxieties of what the character would have in this situation. Then I was like, okay, this is some next level stuff now. So, like, for context, if you're not familiar with Metroid Fusion, what happens is that in that particular game, Samus has been infected by these parasites, and they cut off bits of her power suit and all this other stuff. Takes more damage than she does in pretty much any other Metroid game, and it's very, very much, in its own way, like one of the more subtly horrifying Metroid games, because it's like, okay, I'm off here doing my business. Wow, all these enemies are really strong. Wow, this space station's really abandoned and innocent. It's kind of creepy. If I take 2 hits, I'm dead. A lot of that is like very emblematic in that game, and I think things like that, being able to sort of experience stories like that, was where I was like, okay, I want to be able to do game design. And also just like, I think what it was for me intrinsically, especially once I decided, okay, I'm going to start doing this thing. I started out with making characters for the Mugen fighting game engine, and then as I was releasing those, I'm like, okay, people are using my stuff and they're enjoying it. They're saying it's fun. Wow, this is great. And then that's kind of, I think, the point at which I solidified on I'm doing this for a living for sure.
Cool. You mentioned a couple of the games that inspired you, but what to go into game development proper. But what were some of the games that really stick out in your brain as linchpin games? I mean, you mentioned Metroid Fusion, but were there a couple other ones that were like the prime game experience that really drove you towards being a developer?
Yeah. Okay. So Metroid Fusion. Probably Mario. I'm probably just not thinking of games that I played a lot. Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga for sure. Breath of Fire 3. I will say Street Fighter. It has to be a question of whether or not it was Alpha 3 or Third Strike. Maybe both of them. Those were just 2 of the ones I had the most exposure to when I was growing up.
Sure.
Legend of Legaia. Darn, what else? Yeah, there's a lot. Mega Man Battle Network 4, for sure. The Pokemon, I want to probably say Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, but also just maybe in general. Like
just the Pokemon franchise, sure.
Yeah, just the Pokemon franchise in general. Yeah, I would say those are probably the closest to like linchpin games. Crash Bandicoot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Most definitely. Particularly Warped, the third one. Yeah, those are all games I played probably late elementary, early middle school, and then a couple more in high school. And then by then, I was like pretty much like, all right, I'm in this now.
Cool, yeah. Awesome. So the final thing we always like to ask developers we talk to is what other games being made by indie developers have caught their eye. So is there any other games you want to kind of give a shout out to, or any teams you want to give a shout out to?
Yeah, so Kitsune Games has this particular roguelike called Mid Boss.
Mm.
I will extol the praises of this game and of any code the creator like till the day I die because it's a good game. But basically, the idea behind Mid Boss is that it is a roguelike, but it is kind of like a possession based roguelike.
Mm.
So you have this imp character, and they are basically on like the lowest of the low totem pole in the whole dungeon monster hierarchy thing. And so you play it like a roguelike in that you have to progress through here, knocking out your enemies and doing whatever. But you can also possess them as the imp, learn their abilities, and kind of, still walk around in their house like, oh yeah, possess the zombie. I'm gonna walk around as a zombie for a while, level up in the zombie, learn all the zombie abilities. Once you're all done with that, ditch that body, and then you've retained those traits even in your regular imp form. You can possess more and kind of keep building out from there.
Gotcha.
But like the really innovative thing that I like about it in particular is that it uses this death card system. So you make it however many turns you make it, and then oops, ran into a flaming sword, got butchered and torn apart.
As it happens.
Then when you die, basically you get this card image that you can tweet out. People can use that to sort of pop your world seed and then continue on in their game, or you can use it yourself to retain some of your favorite items and kind of go on that way. It has been very heavily stacked towards becoming more and more and more and more and more accessible, which is something I find particularly impressive. So I'm not good at roguelikes, and I still play mid-boss. I still crank it open every now and then and be like, I just want to try to get a little bit farther. And then if you're even less adept at them at me, like you just have a very nice cruise through mode where you can basically play it without having to do a lot of fighting or anything if you really just want the experience. But if you want to challenge yourself, all that stuff is there.
Perfect.
Like, they hit a really wide gradient.
Awesome. Well, that's a great one to follow up with. Sean, thank you for taking some time to talk to us about Final Spike. As we mentioned, there's an itch page out for Final Spike, so you can find that in the description below in this video, and we'll have some links to some other stuff of Sean's, all his social media and that kind of stuff. So, again, thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.